Ashley Sullivan thought she had executed the perfect deception. For 3 months, she had carried the weight of her secret like a bomb waiting to explode, but she believed she had diffused it with careful timing and flawless acting. She had no idea that her husband Wade possessed a piece of information that would turn her calculated lie into the most spectacular public humiliation Bakersfield had ever witnessed. The morning she walked into their kitchen with the positive pregnancy test, Ashley had rehearsed every word, every gesture, every tear. She had practiced her expression in the bathroom mirror until it looked genuinely surprised and overwhelmed. She positioned herself perfectly in the morning light streaming through their kitchen window, knowing it would make her appear to glow with maternal joy. What Ashley didn't know was that 3 months earlier, Wade had received a manila envelope from his company's mandatory health screening. Inside that envelope was a medical report that contained a single devastating word: azoospermia. Complete male sterility. 0 sperm count. A genetic condition that meant Wade Sullivan had been shooting blanks his entire adult life. As Ashley stood there proclaiming their miracle baby and waiting for Wade's celebratory reaction, she was completely unaware that her husband was doing mathematical calculations in his head. March medical diagnosis. June pregnancy announcement. April conception window. The numbers didn't lie, even if his wife did. Wade's reaction was perfect, exactly what Ashley had hoped for. He smiled broadly, swept her into his arms, and proclaimed himself the happiest man alive. Ashley felt a rush of relief flood through her system. The hardest part was over. Wade believed the baby was his. Her secret was safe. But if Ashley had been paying closer attention to her husband's body language, she might have noticed that his smile never quite reached his eyes. She might have observed that his embrace lasted exactly 3 seconds too long, the pause of a man buying himself time to think. She was so focused on her own performance that she missed the subtle signs that Wade was performing right back. Ashley's affair with Shane Rodriguez had started innocently enough. They were both realtors at Pinnacle Properties, thrown together on joint listings and collaborative marketing campaigns. Shane was everything Wade wasn't: smooth, articulate, financially aggressive. Where Wade smelled like copper wire and coffee, Shane wore expensive cologne and drove a BMW. The progression from professional colleagues to lunch meetings to afternoon strategy sessions at Shane's East Side condo had felt natural, almost inevitable to Ashley. She told herself it wasn't really cheating if they were just talking about business. Then it wasn't really cheating if they shared a few drinks. Then it wasn't really cheating if nothing physical happened at the office. By April, when Wade pulled those 3 consecutive overnight shifts installing power lines at the manufacturing plant, Ashley had already crossed every line she had ever drawn for herself. Those 3 nights at Shane's condo felt like playing house in a parallel universe, where she was married to someone who understood her ambitions, someone who didn't come home exhausted and satisfied with a blue-collar life. When Ashley discovered she was pregnant, her first emotion wasn't joy. It was pure, ice-cold terror. She knew exactly when conception had occurred. Those 3 nights in April when Wade was working and she was at Shane's place, celebrating a major real estate deal with too much wine and too little judgment. For 48 hours, Ashley considered every option. Abortion would solve the immediate problem, but create a lifetime of secret guilt. Confession would destroy her marriage and social standing. But claiming the baby belonged to Wade, that could work if she played it perfectly. Ashley spent those 2 days studying her husband's work schedule, calculating timing, and crafting her story. Wade had been so tired from those overnight shifts that he barely remembered their brief physical encounter when he returned home. If she framed the pregnancy as unexpected but blessed, if she played up the miracle angle, Wade would never question the timing. The key was making Wade feel responsible for her happiness. Ashley had watched her husband for 7 years. She knew his psychology. Wade was a protector, a provider, a man who took pride in taking care of his family. If she presented the pregnancy as their shared blessing, Wade would embrace it as his responsibility. Ashley also understood the power of religious framing in their community. Bakersfield was full of people who believed in miracles, divine intervention, and God's mysterious ways. By presenting the pregnancy as a gift from above, Ashley was creating a narrative that their friends and family would not only accept but celebrate. What Ashley failed to anticipate was that Wade's blue-collar job required annual health screenings for insurance purposes. While she was crafting her deception, Wade was sitting in a doctor's office learning that he was physically incapable of fathering children. The timing was almost comical. Ashley planning to credit Wade with a pregnancy that Wade's own medical records proved was impossible. For 3 months after her announcement, Ashley lived in a state of careful optimism. Wade seemed genuinely excited about the pregnancy. He attended every doctor's appointment, helped her choose baby names, and started talking about converting the spare room into a nursery. Ashley began to believe her own story. Maybe she deserved this happiness. Maybe the baby would somehow bind her marriage together instead of destroying it. Ashley even managed to convince herself that her continued relationship with Shane was somehow justified. She wasn't cheating anymore. She was maintaining a connection with the biological father of her child. She told herself she was being responsible by keeping Shane informed about the pregnancy, even though she could never acknowledge his paternity publicly. But beneath Ashley's carefully constructed confidence, small warning signs began to accumulate like hairline cracks in a foundation. Wade's questions about her work schedule became more specific. His interest in her real estate activities increased dramatically. He started asking about Shane by name, something he had never done before. Most disturbing of all, Wade began volunteering for technical projects around the house, installing new security cameras, upgrading their internet system, replacing the GPS unit in Ashley's car. Ashley dismissed these activities as typical male nesting behavior, but each modification gave Wade greater access to information about her movements and communications. The first crack in Ashley's carefully constructed facade appeared on a Tuesday morning in July. She had just returned from what she told Wade was a late showing with an out-of-town client, but the GPS tracker hidden in her car's rear bumper told a different story. While Ashley thought she was maintaining perfect operational security, Wade was methodically documenting every lie with the patience of a man who understood complex electrical systems. Ashley had no idea that her husband possessed skills that made him a better investigator than any private detective she could have feared. 20 years of troubleshooting industrial power grids had taught Wade to trace problems back to their source, follow circuits through complex pathways, and identify points of failure with surgical precision. To Wade, Ashley's affair was simply another electrical fault that needed to be isolated and repaired. That Tuesday morning, as Ashley fabricated details about her fictional client meeting, Wade was in their garage reviewing GPS data that showed 14 visits to Shane Rodriguez's condo complex in the past 60 days. Ashley's supposed business dinners, late showings, and weekend paperwork sessions all traced back to the same East Side address. Wade had even pulled the property tax records, a simple matter of public information that confirmed Shane's ownership of the condo where Ashley spent her secret afternoons. What terrified Ashley most, though she didn't yet realize it, was how much she had begun to enjoy the deception itself. The elaborate stories she crafted for Wade were becoming more detailed, more creative. She found herself adding unnecessary flourishes to her lies, descriptions of difficult clients, complicated contracts, office politics that didn't exist. Ashley was discovering that she had a natural talent for manipulation, and the power of fooling someone who trusted her completely was intoxicating. But Ashley's growing confidence was built on a foundation she didn't understand. She assumed Wade's continued support meant her secret was secure. She interpreted his increased interest in her work as typical husbandly concern. When Wade asked specific questions about Shane, Ashley thought she was successfully maintaining her cover story by painting Shane as the office antagonist who made her professional life difficult. Ashley had no way of knowing that every complaint she made about Shane was actually providing Wade with crucial intelligence. When she mentioned Shane's arrogance, Wade made note of his personality profile. When she described Shane's expensive car and designer clothes, Wade was calculating how a fellow realtor could afford such luxury on commission income similar to Ashley's. When Ashley claimed Shane was competitive and unethical, Wade was building a psychological profile of a man who would sleep with a married colleague. The pregnancy itself was becoming Ashley's greatest source of both comfort and anxiety. As her body changed and the reality of impending motherhood set in, Ashley, found herself genuinely bonding with the child growing inside her. She began to fantasize about a future where somehow everything would work out, where she could raise Shane's baby in the stability of her marriage to Wade, where her deception would never be discovered, where she could have everything she wanted without consequences. These maternal feelings created a new layer of complexity in Ashley's relationship with Shane. During their secret meetings, she caught herself studying his facial features, wondering which traits the baby might inherit. Shane seemed genuinely excited about the pregnancy, though they both understood he could never publicly claim paternity. Ashley found comfort in Shane's enthusiasm, but it also highlighted the fundamental impossibility of their situation. Meanwhile, Wade's investigation was entering its most dangerous phase, and Ashley remained completely oblivious to the gathering storm. Wade had moved beyond passive surveillance to active intelligence gathering. He was using his technical expertise to monitor Ashley's digital footprint, track her financial transactions, and document her movements with forensic precision. The closest Ashley came to discovering Wade's investigation occurred on a Saturday afternoon in August. She returned home unexpectedly from a supposed client meeting to find Wade in their bedroom, adjusting what appeared to be a smoke detector on the ceiling. When Ashley asked what he was doing, Wade explained that he was upgrading their home security system, a perfectly reasonable project for a man in his profession. Ashley accepted this explanation without question, never realizing that Wade had just installed a motion-activated camera with audio recording capabilities. The smoke detector was actually a sophisticated surveillance device that would capture every private conversation Ashley had in their bedroom, including the late-night phone calls to Shane she thought were undetectable. September, Ashley's pregnancy was becoming visibly obvious, and she found herself enjoying the attention and sympathy that came with impending motherhood. Friends and family members treated her with special care. Colleagues at the real estate office accommodated her schedule, and Wade seemed more attentive than ever. Ashley began to believe that pregnancy suited her, that she was naturally gifted at playing the role of expectant mother. But Ashley's enjoyment of her pregnancy also created new psychological pressures. Every ultrasound appointment, every discussion of baby names, every conversation about the future felt like another layer of deception. Ashley was not just lying about the baby's paternity. She was building an entire fictional family narrative that would require constant maintenance for the rest of her life. The pressure was most intense during family gatherings. When Ashley's parents discussed their excitement about becoming grandparents, when Wade's mother talked about family resemblances and genetic traits, when relatives debated whether the baby would have Wade's eyes or Ashley's smile, Ashley felt the weight of her deception like a physical presence in the room. Shane, for his part, was becoming increasingly bold about their relationship. He began making subtle references to the pregnancy during office meetings, offering to help Ashley with heavy lifting, bringing her special snacks that he claimed were good for pregnant women. Ashley found his attention flattering, but she also recognized the dangerous visibility of his behavior. Other colleagues were beginning to notice Shane's unusual solicitude toward Ashley. Ashley's solution was to intensify her complaints about Shane to Wade. She began describing Shane as increasingly problematic at work, claiming he was trying to steal her clients and undermine her professional reputation. This strategy served two purposes. It explained Shane's presence in her professional life, and it provided cover for any office gossip that might reach Wade about Shane's attention to Ashley. Ashley's world began to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways during October, though she initially attributed the changes to normal pregnancy hormones and third trimester anxiety. Wade's behavior was evolving in directions that should have triggered alarm bells, but Ashley was so invested in maintaining her deception that she interpreted every warning sign as confirmation that her secret remained safe. The most significant change was Wade's sudden enthusiasm for hosting their annual Christmas party. For 6 years of marriage, Ashley had been the one to organize their holiday gatherings, while Wade participated reluctantly, preferring quiet celebrations to large social events. But this October, Wade not only suggested they host a Christmas party, he volunteered to handle all the technical arrangements himself. Ashley was delighted by Wade's initiative. She interpreted his enthusiasm as evidence that he was genuinely excited about their expanding family and wanted to share their joy with their community. When Wade proposed inviting everyone they knew, both families, neighbors, friends, and Ashley's entire real estate office, Ashley saw it as the perfect opportunity to celebrate their pregnancy publicly and cement the narrative of their happy marriage. What Ashley didn't realize was that Wade was planning the most methodically executed public humiliation in the history of their small town. Every detail he volunteered to handle, the sound system, the video presentation, the lighting setup, was designed to create the perfect environment for revealing the truth about Ashley's deception with maximum psychological impact. Ashley's excitement about the Christmas party was intensified by her growing confidence in her ability to manage the complex social dynamics of her secret. She had successfully navigated 7 months of pregnancy while maintaining her affair with Shane, satisfying Wade's need for a devoted wife, and preserving her professional reputation. Ashley began to believe she possessed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that allowed her to manipulate multiple relationships simultaneously. This confidence led Ashley to make increasingly bold decisions. When Wade suggested inviting Shane to the Christmas party, claiming it would be good for professional networking, Ashley not only agreed, but actively encouraged the idea. She told Wade that including her entire office would demonstrate their strong marriage and stable home life. Ashley even suggested that Shane might bring his wife, thinking it would provide perfect cover for their secret relationship. Ashley's rationalization for inviting Shane revealed the depth of her psychological investment in the deception. She convinced herself that having Shane at the party would actually strengthen her cover story. If Wade could see Shane and his wife together in a social setting, Wade would never suspect that Shane was the father of Ashley's child. Ashley was so confident in her manipulative abilities that she believed she could orchestrate a social gathering where her husband, her lover, and the biological father of her child could all celebrate together without anyone discovering the truth. But Ashley's growing boldness was creating exactly the conditions Wade needed to execute his perfect revenge. Every suggestion Ashley made, every guest she wanted to invite, every detail she added to the party planning was providing Wade with additional opportunities to maximize the psychological impact of his revelation. During November, as Ashley focused on party preparations and baby preparations, Wade was conducting the final phase of his investigation with surgical precision. Ashley remained completely unaware that her husband was using his electrical expertise to document her every movement and communication. The home security upgrades Wade had installed throughout their house were actually a sophisticated surveillance network that captured Ashley's private phone conversations, recorded her daily routines, and monitored her digital activities. The most damaging evidence came from Ashley's late-night phone calls to Shane. After Wade fell asleep each evening, Ashley would retreat to their bathroom or walk out to their backyard to call Shane on her personal cell phone. These conversations, which Ashley believed were completely private, were being recorded by motion-activated devices Wade had installed throughout their property. In these calls, Ashley revealed not only the intimate details of her relationship with Shane, but also her strategies for maintaining the deception with Wade. Ashley discussed her plans for managing the birth, her ideas for ensuring Shane could maintain contact with his biological child, and her long-term vision for continuing their affair even after the baby arrived. Ashley's voice, captured in crystal-clear digital audio, provided Wade with undeniable evidence of her calculated betrayal. Ashley also made the fatal mistake of discussing Wade himself during these calls. She described Wade as predictably trusting, laughed about how easily she could manipulate his emotions, and expressed confidence that Wade would never suspect her deception because he was too simple to understand complex relationship dynamics. These recordings would prove to be the most psychologically devastating evidence Wade collected, not just proof of Ashley's infidelity, but documentation of her contempt for the man whose trust she was exploiting. The irony of Ashley's situation was becoming almost theatrical. While she believed she was successfully deceiving Wade through superior intelligence and psychological manipulation, Wade was using actual technical skills and methodical investigation to document every aspect of her betrayal. Ashley was playing checkers while Wade was playing chess, and she had no idea the game was already over. As December approached and Ashley's due date grew closer, she found herself experiencing genuine anxiety about maintaining her deception after the baby's birth. The child would eventually develop recognizable features that might reveal Shane's paternity. Ashley would need to explain any resemblance to Shane while ensuring the baby never had direct contact with his biological father in social settings. Ashley's solution was to begin planting seeds for a potential future relocation. She started mentioning job opportunities in other cities, suggesting that a change of scenery might be good for their growing family. Ashley's plan was to gradually move their family away from Bakersfield, creating physical distance between Wade and Shane that would make accidental discovery less likely. But Ashley's long-term planning was irrelevant because Wade's short-term planning was nearly complete, while Ashley worried about managing her deception. For years to come, Wade was preparing to end her deception in spectacular fashion in a matter of weeks. The Christmas party Ashley was so excited to attend would become the stage for the most complete and public destruction of a reputation their community had ever witnessed. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of perfect weather that Ashley interpreted as a good omen for her carefully orchestrated celebration. The sun was shining, the temperature was mild, and their backyard looked picture perfect for hosting 60 guests. Ashley spent the morning arranging catering tables and adjusting decorations, completely unaware that Wade was conducting final sound checks on the audio-visual equipment that would destroy her life in a matter of hours. Ashley had chosen her outfit with particular care, a flowing red dress that accentuated her pregnant figure while maintaining an air of elegant sophistication. She wanted to look like the perfect expectant mother, radiant with maternal joy and secure in her loving marriage. As she applied her makeup, Ashley practiced the expression of delighted surprise she would wear when Wade's video presentation revealed their baby's gender. She had no idea that Wade's slideshow would reveal something entirely different. The early guests began arriving at 6:00 p.m., and Ashley moved through her living room like a woman hosting the triumph of her social career. Her parents were beaming with pride about their future grandchild. Wade's mother was practically vibrating with grandmother excitement. Neighbors complimented Ashley on her glow. Colleagues from the real estate office praised her for maintaining such professionalism during pregnancy, and everyone seemed genuinely happy to celebrate this milestone in the Sullivan family's life. Shane Rodriguez arrived precisely at 6:30 p.m., and Ashley felt a familiar flutter of excitement mixed with anxiety as she watched him work the room. He wore a tailored navy suit that emphasized his confident bearing and expensive taste. Shane moved through the party with practiced ease, shaking hands with Wade's blue-collar friends, charming Ashley's female colleagues, and positioning himself as the successful real estate professional who belonged in any social setting. What Ashley found most thrilling was watching Shane interact with Wade. The two men shook hands with apparent warmth, discussed holiday plans with seeming interest, and even shared what appeared to be good-natured jokes about the real estate market. Ashley interpreted this successful social interaction as evidence that her deception was so complete that her husband and her lover could stand in the same room without creating any tension or suspicion. Ashley was particularly pleased by Wade's demeanor throughout the early part of the party. He seemed relaxed, confident, and genuinely happy to be hosting their friends and family. Wade moved through the crowd with the easy manner of a man who was proud of his Oahu home, his wife, and his expanding family. Ashley saw Wade's apparent contentment as confirmation that she had successfully navigated the most challenging months of her deception. At 7 p.m., Wade gathered everyone in the living room for what Ashley anticipated would be the evening's highlight. Wade had set up a large projector screen where their Christmas tree normally stood, and Ashley positioned herself beside her husband with one hand on her pregnant belly, looking like the queen of their holiday celebration. The crowd arranged itself comfortably around the room, phones emerged to record the special moment, and Ashley prepared to experience the culmination of 7 months of successful deception. Wade addressed their guests with a warmth and sincerity that made Ashley's heart swell with genuine affection for the man she had been betraying. Wade spoke about how much he and Ashley valued honesty in their marriage, how truth was the foundation of any lasting relationship, and how excited they were to share this special moment with everyone they loved. Ashley found herself genuinely moved by Wade's words, feeling a complex mixture of guilt and gratitude for his obvious devotion to their marriage. When Wade pressed play on the remote control, Ashley experienced what would be the last moment of pure happiness in her adult life. The music started, a soft acoustic love song Ashley recognized from their wedding, and the first slides appeared exactly as she had expected. Their wedding day looked radiant on the large screen. Their honeymoon in Napa Valley brought smiles from the crowd. The house they had bought together represented everything Ashley loved about the life they had built. Ashley leaned against Wade's shoulder, playing the part of the adoring wife for what she thought was the culmination of her performance. The crowd was reacting with exactly the kind of warm appreciation Ashley had hoped for. Family members were commenting on favorite memories, friends were reminiscing about shared experiences, and everyone seemed genuinely happy to celebrate the Sullivan family's joy. Then the music stopped. The abrupt silence created a moment of confusion that sent the first spike of adrenaline through Ashley's system. The screen went black for several seconds, and Ashley felt the first flutter of genuine anxiety. This wasn't part of the plan they had discussed. Wade had promised a simple gender reveal slideshow, not some elaborate production with dramatic pauses. When the new document appeared on the screen, Ashley's brain initially refused to process what she was seeing. The official letterhead looked medical, the text was sized for maximum visibility, but the words themselves seemed impossible. Diagnosis: azoospermia, complete male sterility. Ashley's first thought was that Wade had somehow included the wrong document, that this was a mistake that would require embarrassed explanations and nervous laughter. But as the silence in the room deepened, and Ashley felt Wade's body language change beside her, the reality began to penetrate her consciousness like ice water flooding her veins. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. Wade knew. Wade had known all along. Ashley's entire deception had been built on a foundation of ignorance that had never existed. The next slide appeared with mathematical precision. Medical diagnosis, March 15th. Pregnancy announcement, June 8th. Conception. Date, April 15th. Paternity, probability, 0.0%. Ashley felt the room tilting around her as the implications crashed through her mind like dominoes falling in sequence. Wade had received his medical diagnosis 3 months before her pregnancy announcement. Wade had known she was lying from the moment she walked into their kitchen with the positive pregnancy test. Wade had been planning this revelation for 7 months. Ashley's mother gasped, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the silence like broken glass. Ashley tried to grab the remote control from Wade's hands, her movements desperate and clumsy, screaming that this was some kind of sick joke, that Wade had lost his mind, that none of this could be real. But Wade held the remote high above her reach and addressed the room in a voice that carried calm authority to every corner of their living room. "If the baby isn't mine," Wade announced to their 60 guests, "then whose is it?" Ashley felt her knees weaken as the next slide appeared. It was a GPS tracking map showing her car's movement patterns over the past 3 months. Red dots clustered around Shane's address like evidence markers at a crime scene. The data was precise, undeniable, and completely damning. Destination: Shane Rodriguez residence. Frequency: 14 documented visits in 60 days. Purpose: you tell me. Ashley looked like she was about to vomit on her own living room floor. The mathematical precision of Wade's evidence was destroying any possibility of explanation or denial, but the worst was yet to come. In the back of the crowd, Ashley heard the sound of shattering glass as Shane dropped his beer bottle, his face draining of color as he realized his life was about to be destroyed in front of his colleagues, his wife, and Ashley's entire family. The final slide appeared with the devastating clarity of high-definition photography. It was the image Wade had captured in July, Shane kneeling beside Ashley's car in his condo's parking lot, his hands on her pregnant stomach, kissing her belly with obvious tenderness and joy. The text overlay didn't announce a baby's gender. Instead, it declared in massive red letters, "It's his." Ashley's scream wasn't one of fear. It was the sound of complete psychological devastation. She tried to block the screen with her body, but the truth was 10 feet tall and impossible to hide. Her carefully constructed deception was being demolished with the methodical precision of a demolition expert, and everyone she had ever cared about was witnessing her complete humiliation. Ashley's father walked to the front of the room, his face a mask of shock and disappointment. He looked at the evidence on the screen, looked at his daughter sobbing on the floor, looked at Shane trying to back toward the exit, and asked the question that hung in the air like smoke. "Ashley, is this true?" Ashley tried to deny everything, her voice rising to a shriek as she claimed Wade was insane, that he had fabricated the medical records, that this was all an elaborate revenge fantasy. But Wade's calm voice cut through her hysteria with devastating logic. "I didn't fake my sterility diagnosis, Ashley. And I certainly didn't fake the man standing in our living room who looks like he wants to disappear into the floor." Every head turned toward Shane, who was trapped against the wall by angry family members and shocked colleagues. Shane's wife was staring at him with the expression of a woman watching her entire life collapse in real time. Ashley's professional reputation was being destroyed in front of her entire office staff. Her family relationships were disintegrating before her eyes. Her marriage was ending in the most public and humiliating way possible. Wade told Ashley to leave. His voice carried the authority of a man who had planned every detail of this moment for 7 months. He explained that he had already consulted a divorce attorney about the adultery clause in their prenuptial agreement. Ashley would receive nothing but her personal belongings and her car. She could take Shane too, if she wanted him. Wade walked into the kitchen and emerged with a cold beer, the picture of calm satisfaction. He locked the back door and watched through the window as both families dragged Ashley to their cars in various states of shock and disgust. He watched Shane sprint to his vehicle like a man fleeing a crime scene, his wife following behind with tears streaming down her face. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and merciless. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew. Shane was the biological father. Shane lost his real estate license after the Professional Ethics Board reviewed his conduct. His wife filed for divorce within 2 weeks. Ashley's reputation in Bakersfield's real estate market was completely destroyed. Clients canceled listings, colleagues avoided her, and her professional network evaporated overnight. Ashley found herself raising Shane's child in a 1-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of town, working part-time retail jobs because no real estate agency would hire her. Shane moved to another state to escape the social destruction, abandoning both Ashley and his biological child. The man Ashley had risked everything to be with disappeared from her life the moment the cost of their relationship became real. Wade kept the house, his job, his reputation, and his dignity. His methodical approach to justice became legendary in their small town. The story of the electrician who used his technical skills to expose his wife's deception in the most spectacular way possible. Wade's patience, precision, and perfect timing turned what could have been a private divorce into a community-witnessed validation of traditional values and male honor. As Ashley reflected on the complete destruction of her life, she finally understood the fatal flaw in her psychological calculations. She had assumed that successful deception required superior intelligence and sophisticated manipulation. But Wade had proven that the most effective revenge doesn't require complex psychology. It simply requires patient observation, methodical planning, and the discipline to let guilty people provide the rope for their own hanging. Sometimes the most devastating truth isn't that people are capable of elaborate cruelty, but that they're often eager to celebrate their own destruction if you just give them the right stage.